Konnichiwa, F1 fans, and welcome back to F1 Brake Check, the only podcast where the takes are hotter than Lawson's brakes and the metaphors are more twisted than the 130R. This week, we're talking all things Japanese Grand Prix, the land of sushi and samurai. Today's episode will feature an all-new tech corner where Corey and I will explain the finer points of the DRS system. We'll preview the Grand Prix of Bahrain. We'll watch steam come out of my head during Stump the Pundit, and we'll have our latest reactions to this weekend's action from Japan. So settle back, pour some sake, and get ready for the chaos that is F1 Brake Check.
Welcome. You are listening to F1 Brake Check, the epic podcast for all things Formula One, where we discuss technology, history, news, and perspective. With your hosts, Scott Vick and Corey Broom.
All right, we're back with F1 Brake Check. My name is Scott Vick. I am one of your hosts. With me, as always, is my pundit for life, my ride or die, my brother in arms, Mr. Corey Broom. Corey, how you doing this week, sir?
It's only Tuesday, and it feels like it's Friday. It's been a very busy week, and it's only been 2 days. So it's but you know, one great thing is Friday we get our monthly hangout time. Since
Yes.
I had to cancel last month to Whirlwind Adventures. Looking forward to it.
Exactly. I am so ready for it.
How about you? How's your week been? Or
It is. I'm like you. It's been a grind. It seems like for every I feel like I'm living like in dog years. I feel like every one day is like 7 work days.
Yeah.
So it's I feel like I'm aging way faster than what I was even 6 months ago. So it's just it's just been brutal.
Right.
But I am ready to I'm ready to talk some Formula One. How about you?
Same here. Same.
All right then. Okay, so this week in our tech corner, we're going to be talking about DRS. I know we've talked about aerodynamics, we've talked about DRS in kind of a higher level, but we've never really gotten into the fine points of DRS on how it works, why it exists, things like that. And so I thought we would take a little bit deeper dive, especially because of all of the talk that was around the DRS this week at the Japanese Grand Prix. DRS was introduced in 2011 because the FIA and Formula One were trying to improve the quality of racing. Because before 2011, the drivers would constantly complain, and passing was very, very difficult because at the time, the cars had flat bottoms, which meant that there was the airflow coming out from underneath the car was all being channeled through the diffuser behind the gearbox. But that air would then take and be swept up over and around the rear wing. And then the rear wing was also generating a lot of quote unquote dirty air, which is if you remember back to our talk about basic aerodynamics in Formula One, the dirty air is the air that is coming off the trailing edge of the rear wing and through the diffuser, and it creates these vortices, and which takes and disrupts the airflow. So if another car is following closely behind, it takes the air away from the front wing of the car, which then takes and causes the tires to wear faster, and it also takes away downforce as they go into a corner. So it makes it very hard for a trailing car in order to be able to take and follow another car closely through a corner. So it made overtaking excruciatingly difficult. So DRS was introduced in an effort to take and try to increase straight line speed so that it would make it a little easier for a trailing car to be able to take and execute a pass when the cars went into the braking zone. So this was, thought to be, a way to make the racing a little more entertaining. Now, there was a lot of people who said that, oh, well, this is going to take away, the art of the pass and things like that. But the problem was, though, and this is something I totally agreed with when they first introduced DRS, is that, yes, something needed to be done because, the art of the pass was already dying because you literally cars couldn't get close enough to each other in most cases in order to be able, because unless you could take and get past a car very quickly, if you spent more than a lap or two behind another car that you couldn't get around, you were going to eat up your tires and just completely destroy your own race.
Right.
And in fact, at that point, it had gotten to the point where the undercut had become so prevalent, and where in most Grand Prix, all the passing was being done in the pit lane, because if you had one car that was stuck behind another car that couldn't get around, even if it was a slower back marker car, they would pull them into the pits in an effort to take and try to get them in and then get them out in front of the other car. And so all the passing seemed to be, or the vast majority of passing was taking place in the pit lane, which was, killing the racing and everything. So that's the reason why DRS was introduced in the first place. So how does DRS work? Okay, so basically what it is there is an actuator, or basically a little tiny motor that is attached to the rear wing in the center of it, that attaches to the rear flap of the rear wing highest element. And the driver has the ability to press a button on the steering wheel. And when he presses that button, the flap will open up, which then takes and decreases the drag on the car and can give the car anywhere between 15 to 20 extra kilometers per hour speed advantage over a car that does not have the DRS flap open. Now, the thing is, though, is that the drivers cannot use DRS all the time. During practice and qualifying, there are designated DRS zones on the racetrack. Most people are familiar with this concept. So it's always on the straightaway, because otherwise, if they tried to do it through the corner, they would lose all downforce, and then the cars would be sliding all over the place. And we'll get more into that in a moment. But basically, each track has a set of designated DRS zones. Some have 2 or 3, some only have 1. It all is basically based upon how the track is laid out and where it's logically possible to take and put a DRS zone, because all the DRS zones have to be a certain minimum distance long. So you can't just have a DRS zone like in a very, very short straightaway that's only like, maybe 200 or 300 meters, because it's not going to give the driver enough of the following driver fast enough of a advantage anyway. So, and for safety reasons, that's the reason why they only have these certain DRS zones. Now, in practice and in qualifying, the drivers can open the DRS flap in the DRS zone at any time that they so choose. Now, usually they won't do it like on warm-up laps or cool-down laps or things like that. It's only when they're on a quote-unquote hot lap or flying lap, which means that they are driving at speed. The DRS can only be used when the trailing driver is within 1 second of the leading driver. And they can only use that after the first lap of the race has been completed, or after the first lap of any restart, whether it be standing or rolling. Then DRS is enabled by race control. Now, how do the drivers know when they can and when they can't use it? There is what is called a DRS detection zone, which is usually, depending upon the track, is at a certain distance before the DRS zone actually occurs. And so the trailing driver, if he's within 1 second, when he reaches that DRS zone, a signal is sent to his car, and on the lights on his steering wheel, he'll see whether or not he has DRS at his disposal. And then at that point, once he enters the DRS zone, he can press the button, the flap opens, and away he goes. Now, the thing is, though, is that the drivers have to time their DRS activation correctly, because if they try to activate it while they are not in a DRS zone, the car will know that they are not in a DRS zone, and therefore it delays the opening of the flap. So if the driver hits the button too soon to try to open up the DRS, then it's actually could be, several meters past the point where the DRS zone starts before they can actually get the flap open in order to take advantage of that drag reduction. That notification that they get on the lights on their steering wheel is also activated. That light will only activate when DRS has been activated by race control. So, for example, say in a race like China this year, or I'm sorry, not China, in a race like Australia, where you had wet and dry conditions and things like that, they will at any time race control can either activate or deactivate the usage of DRS. And if they deactivate DRS because of the weather conditions, because DRS is not allowed to be used in the rain. So once the stewards have determined that the track is too wet, usually about the time that they have to start taking on intermediates, that's when they'll deactivate DRS and the drivers no longer have that at their disposal. Now, if the rain passes, track starts to dry out, then race control can reactivate DRS. And at that point, they'll get a light on their steering wheel that says DRS has been activated. And also, usually, they'll get a radio call from the teams as well to let them know, in addition, in case they just happen to miss the light on the steering wheel. One other thing, though, to remember about DRS too is that when the driver can press the button to open the flap for his DRS, and he can also press the button again to close the DRS manually. Now, the DRS will also close automatically as soon as he either takes his foot completely off the throttle, meaning zero input on the throttle, or the moment he touches the brakes. So that's kind of the finer points of why DRS exists, how DRS is executed, and when the drivers are allowed to use DRS and when they're not allowed to use DRS.
When is it really an unfair advantage to have DRS enabled?
When sometimes is it an unfair advantage? Depending upon the track and where the DRS zones are laid out, and more specifically where the DRS detection zones are at, there are times where a driver can actually be following a car within 1 second, be allowed to use DRS, but then they're able to execute a pass into a corner before, because the DRS detection zone is actually before a corner that then leads into the DRS zone. Hungary is a prime example of this. So the front straightaway at the Hungaroring is a DRS zone, but then it also has a DRS detection midway through the first corner, and then there is another DRS zone at the end of coming out of turn 3 through that straightaway. So if a driver hits the detection zone at the end of the first straight and is able to execute a pass shortly after getting into the DRS zone, and then is still ahead when they get to the second DRS zone coming out of turn 3, then they can open up that flap and actually use that to pull away from the car that they just passed. And there's a couple instances of this at various tracks, like Miami's another track where because of where the DRS detection is at and where the DRS actually is activated, there's a possibility that a driver can make a pass on somebody when they're behind a car at the detection point, but then they're able to pass them and then already be in the lead when they enter the DRS zone. And then at that point, they can open up the flap and then use that to actually pull away from the driver in front of them. And the other driver, if they didn't already have if they were not already following another car, which gets into the whole dreaded DRS trains that we hear so much about during the broadcast, if they don't have that, then they can't open up their DRS because they're the ones that the pass was just got executed on. And they're basically a sitting duck because the other car now has that speed advantage of being able to just pull away from them.
Right. So why was DRS such an issue at Suzuka?
Okay, so remember when I was talking about how stepping on the brake or taking your foot off the throttle will automatically close the DRS flap? Well, at Suzuka, they repaved the entire first sector during the off season, and that new pavement provided a tremendous level of additional grip that wasn't there during the race last year. Now, Suzuka is also one of the few tracks that only has one DRS zone because it only has one long straightaway that's really long enough in order to facilitate the use of DRS. And that is DRS zone is coming down the front straightaway into the first corner. Now, once upon a time, before the repavement, the drivers would have to lift going into turn one. They usually never braked, but
Yeah.
they did have to lift, and that lift would automatically close the DRS flap. Well, this year, because of the higher grip levels from the repavement, they really didn't have to
Hmm.
lift. They could go flat out into turn one after coming down the straightaway. Well, if they were coming flat out down the front straightaway, and they didn't lift, then the DRS flap was still open. Well, when the DRS flap is open, it reduces the drag, but it also significantly reduces the downforce. And what does the rear wing
Yeah.
on a Formula One car do? It produces the downforce that drives the rear wheels into the ground. Well, now you take away all that downforce and you take and try to push the car through a corner, you're going to have no grip on the rear
Yeah.
end. And that's exactly what caught out Isaac Hadjar this year during FP1 is because remember I said that the driver also had the ability to press press the DRS button on their steering wheel to manually close the flap as well. And that's what all of the drivers were having to do this year is they had to remember to going into turn one, they had to remember to hit that button to take and shut off the DRS going into the turn so that they didn't lose the back end and wind up in the tire barrier like poor Isaac did and made his mechanics have to put the whole car back together overnight. One other thing, though, to remember about DRS too is that when the driver can press the button to open the flap for his DRS, and he can also press the button again to close the DRS manually. Now, the DRS will also close automatically as soon as he either takes his foot completely off the throttle, meaning zero input on the throttle, or the moment he touches the brakes.
We all know that there's going to be a lot of changes in 2026 as far as the rules go. How is this going to affect DRS?
Okay, well, the DRS system as we know it is going away. So now the cars will employ a technology called active aero, which works very much like DRS in some respects in the fact that it was able to change, because right now under the rules, other than the DRS, none of the rest of the aerodynamic elements on the car are allowed to be manipulated while the car is in motion. So, as we've talked about before, when we talked about aerodynamics, the front wings, the rear wings, different parts of the car can all be adjusted in the pit during when the drivers and the teams are setting up the cars for the race. Now, once the car takes to the track, other than the DRS flap, those elements must stay more or less static. Now, the flexi wings is a different discussion for a different time, but that's basically the way that it works is that those elements have to stay more or less stationary. Well, and nobody's really 100% sure how it's going to completely work, but basically the teams are going to be allowed to manipulate more of the aerodynamics on the car, and the drivers will have the discretion of when they want to deploy that. So it may be they want to set the car up with less aerodynamic downforce so that they can get more speed on the straightaways, and then they deploy the active aero to generate more downforce as they go into the corners. Or for a very tight circuit like the Hungaroring we were talking about earlier, where it's a very high downforce track, then it might be where they set it up for more downforce for all of the different corners and everything, but have the active aero set up so that they can open up different parts of the aerodynamics on the car for on the straightaways, much like DRS is employed now. So it's really going to be kind of much more up to the teams and the drivers on how they want to deploy and be able to take and actively change the aerodynamics on the car while they're out on track.
Gotcha. I think that's it for my questions with DRS.
All right, then. So tell us what you think. If you liked what you heard, put it down in the comments. Or if we got something completely wrong, let us know. So can't wait to hear from you guys. So, all right. So we are on to what is undoubtedly anybody who has listened to this show for any amount of time can tell you, this is my favorite part of the week. So this is where Corey will take and try to stump me with a series of trivia questions to try to stump my long time knowledge of the sport of Formula One and its history. So, Corey, what do you have for me this week?
Kind of light on the question, so I figured, or the topic. So I figured, oh, why not take this last race and turn it into somewhat of a trivia. Some of these I think you'll get pretty easily, but hopefully there'll be a couple of challenges in here.
All right.
So, which strategic decision, helped Max maintain his lead throughout the Grand Prix in Japan?
Well, mostly it was making sure that his first stop, the undercut at Suzuka is very, very strong. And so that's really kind of where Max made, and Red Bull made the correct decision, was in the fact that they pitted very early on in the race so that way McLaren couldn't undercut them.
That's one of them, but the one that I was really looking for was is a one stop
strategy.
Tire. Yeah.
Yes.
Well, and going on to the hards, because
Mm-hmm.
the hards were really the tire to have in Japan.
Yes, very much so.
All right, number 2. What made McLaren's double podium particularly significant?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know.
Okay. How about this? I'll give you some multiple choice.
Okay.
Was it A, their first podium of the season? Both cars finished within seconds of the race winner. It was their first 2-3 finish since 2010. Or they outperformed Ferrari and Mercedes?
It is definitely 2 and 4. Or B and D, because it was not their first podium, so
No.
but so it was definitely they outperformed both Mercedes and Ferrari.
Yeah.
Now wait a minute. Okay, so I think actually no, because I think Oscar was what, 1 point something seconds behind Max at the end, so I guess it actually wasn't B, so I guess it would just be D.
D. Yep.
Okay. Yeah, because it was like Lando was only like 7, if I remember correctly. I don't have the stats in front of me at the moment, but if I believe that Lando was like 7/10 of a second behind Max, and Oscar was like 1 point something. I know it was less than like 1.6 seconds or something like that behind Max. So so it was still a fairly close and fairly tight race.
Right. All right. So, which sector of the Suzuka circuit proved the most decisive for lap time differentiation? I can give you multiple choice here.
I'm going to say it was probably sector 3, because that seemed to be the one area where, some drivers like Antonelli had some real problems, especially coming through the chicane. And that seemed to be the place where, especially in the closing stages of the race, where Lando was really really trying to close up the gap on Max. So I'm going to go with sector 3.
I was looking for sector 1, the S's and the Dunlop curve, because the drivers that were able to maintain their flow and downforce through these turns and these curves, they were able to gain actually tenths on each lap in these curves.
Interesting.
That was the one I was looking for.
And
that's it for Stump the Pundit.
All right, sounds great. Okay, fun stuff. I like that. kind of a little more of a brain teaser for this week.
Yeah.
All right, so let's get into our news and reactions. So first of all, I'm going to go out and say this is probably one of the most boring races in Japan in a very, very long time. In the fact that we did not have, with the exception of Isaac Hodger and Lewis Hamilton swapping places, otherwise the top 10 finished exactly as they qualified and started the race, which is the first time that has happened on a permanent race circuit in a very, very long time. So your thoughts on the racing quality this week?
Yeah, I mean, it really boiled down to purely on strategy. There wasn't a whole lot of overtaking. Um, yeah, it was very reminiscent of Monaco as far as the excitement goes.
Yes. Yeah, it was definitely it was I've heard the term snooze fest bandied around
Yeah,
because
definitely.
it because the extreme lack of any kind of strategic advantage, any kind of, you know, on track battles. I mean, there was a couple of good on track
Yeah,
battles, but
not
they would
many
happen
though. Yeah,
much further down in the field. You know, it was like it was a lot of the cars that were scrapping well outside of the points were the only ones that seemed to be having any kind of, you know, real racing back there, whereas the top 10 was just pretty much status quo as we went through the race.
yeah, right.
After an absolute brilliant drive for Max to qualify on pole by 1/1000th
Yeah.
of a second, can we say Red Bull is back?
Just like what we were talking about last week, I think still think it's way too early. I mean, truly, it's been one race, and in my opinion, I wouldn't say back necessarily because I mean, if we looked at the straights, McLaren was right on Max. It was only because of Max being able to go through the S's and go through the turns. That's where he got them. It wasn't straight line speeds. So they're better, yes. They're not back, I would say. Or at least
No,
the jury's still out saying whether or not they're back, quote unquote.
I don't think they're back. I think this was just simply a matter of this is a track. Suzuka, as it was as we mentioned last week during the preview, and as you know, they mentioned time and time again during the Sky Sports telecast. If Jacques Villeneuve said it once, he said it
Yeah.
15 times over the course of the weekend that Suzuka truly is a driver's track. It is a track, and as we talked about during the preview last week when I was talking about my own experiences of driving the simulators
Mm-hmm.
through, you know, around Suzuka, that if if it's truly a track that separates the greats from the just from the good, and it's one of those tracks that takes and just truly when a driver is on it and they are just so perfectly precise in the placement of the car, they can actually do things with they can definitely hide a lot of the deficiencies in a car. So I am going to say no, Red Bull is not back. This was just a one-off in the hands of one of the greatest
Yeah.
drivers that Formula One has ever seen. And, you know, because I have come to put Max right up there, especially after this drive, after the brilliant qualifying. You know, I put Max right up there in the pantheon of the greatest drivers in Formula One. I put him right up there with the Sennas and
Yeah.
the Schumachers and the Mansells and, you know, the Stewarts. So, you know, I definitely think that it really lent itself more to just the great, phenomenal driver on a track that suited him probably better than anybody else in the field. Because you're right, the McLarens in a straight line were significantly faster. It was only through the S's and the Dunlop curve that Max was able to maintain that distance because, like I was saying before, in a lot of places, like in the, especially in Sector 3, you know, Lando and Oscar were definitely closing that gap, but then they would get into Sector 1, and then that's where Max would just kind of
Yeah.
pull away.
Right.
So yeah, so I'm going to go out and say no. Red Bull is not back. Now they looked better,
Yeah.
but they are not back.
I agree wholeheartedly.
So with that in mind, let's talk about, you know, we talked a lot last week about the big news about Yuki being promoted to that second Red Bull seat. Now, I was wrong. I said that Yuki would score points. I was wrong, but he didn't miss by much.
No.
He didn't have a great qualifying. You know, it's like it was really Yuki's whole weekend to me just seemed to be a lot of inconsistency because during FP1, during FP3, he looked really good. FP2, he was kind of off the pace a little bit, like
Yeah.
he was struggling, which I think partially had to do with trying, it's just lack of experience with the car. Like we said, before Friday, he had never actually driven this year's car other than in the simulator.
Right.
So this was finally his first chance so it's like there might be, it's, as we saw, with other drivers, which I think it was Doohan, who had basically had his nuts in a vice the whole, through Q1 of qualifying, even though Red Bull and Racing Bulls are sister teams, the cars are still significantly different, and they're significantly, and that includes things like driver positions and the ways that the seats are mounted, which means that it's a totally different seat for Yuki in the Red Bull than what it is in the Racing Bulls. So it might be a matter of, they haven't gotten the seat tweaked quite well, quite to perfection, where because Lawson had the whole offseason to play
Yeah.
around with his seat and get it exactly the way that he wanted so that when he was in the car, he was as comfortable as possible. Whereas Yuki basically had a week to get his seat, get fitted for the seat, get, the seat fitted into the car, test it out. I'm sure that the whole, button and dial layout of the wheels are totally different. So it was just, there were so many things that I definitely can see that, but at times he looked really, really great. So I've talked long enough. So your thoughts?
No, I think given his position, the stress, everything on top of that, I think that the placement that he got, I think was really, really good. Because again, take nothing away from Lawson. He is a phenomenal driver. Do not, just because he didn't do well at Red Bull does not mean he's not a good driver. He's a great driver. So knowing that and seeing where Lawson was versus what Yuki was able to do, I think really goes more into what you were saying last week, in that the Red Bull car really suits Yuki's style of driving. I think as he gets more comfortable with that car, we're going to see really great things with him, and he'll be closer to the max than what we've seen in the past few drivers in that
Yeah,
second seat.
absolutely. And I think that, like I said, I really thought that Yuki was going to, surprise everybody and was going to be in the points. I even made that as my prediction last week during our preview for this weekend's race. And he, but again, like I said, he finished 12th, so he wasn't far out of the points. Now, Lawson, was able to out qualify him. Isaac Hodger was able to out qualify him. And Isaac was able to outrun him in the Red Bull, in the Racing Bull. But
Yeah.
Yuki did it, come ahead. Did finish ahead of Lawson. Lawson faded pretty badly during the course of the race.
Yeah.
So even to go from 15th to 12th and be knocking on the door,
Yeah.
I think it's definitely a testament to that Yuki is the driver that should have been there all along, because
Yeah.
my whole thinking is that if Yuki had been able to take and do all of the work in the off season, had been able to take and do, the preseason testing at Bahrain, had he been there for the first two races, I definitely think that, he would be much closer. So now they're kind of behind the eight ball, but I think that Yuki will come up to speed. Now, I don't think that, like I said last week, do I think that he's going to be, in a position to like challenge Max and everything by the time we get to Bahrain this weekend? No, I don't really expect to see. I really think it'll take him about three races to really settle into the car, which a lot of people will say, well, they should have given Lawson three races. And it was like, no, Lawson showed just how unprepared he was, to not from a talent perspective, but just from a preparation and
Yeah.
driving style. He was not ready for the challenges of the Red Bull in racing trim. Whereas I think Yuki is, but he's still going to have to find, it's those little nuances and stuff that he's still
Right.
got to figure out. That's still going to take, and with the limited, testing and everything and stuff, that I guarantee you he is in the simulator probably right now
Oh,
as
yeah,
we
I bet.
speak,
Yeah.
busting his ass to take and learn as many of those little nuances as he possibly can before they get to Bahrain on
Yeah.
Friday.
Yeah.
So having said all of that, are we in agreement that, or am I totally out on an island of my own to say that the Racing Bulls is actually a better car right now than the Red Bull?
And if you would have said that at the beginning of the season, I would have laughed, thinking you were joking. But man, I don't think so. I think you're dead on. They're at least very, very close, if not surpassing Red Bull at this point. That's how bad the car is.
Yeah. It really is. And that's kind of my thinking is I'm really of the opinion that the Racing Bull is actually a better car. And it's only because of the sublime
Max.
talent that we have
Yep.
talked about time and time again of Max Verstappen is the only reason why that one Red Bull has been consistent, has been always ahead of the Racing Bulls. That if it were not for Max's talent in that car, I do really think that the Racing Bulls would be regularly out qualifying and out racing the Red Bulls at the moment.
Right. No, I totally agree.
Okay, so are we in agreement that McLaren made a very strategic blunder this weekend in not trying to undercut Max at the first stops, and that they goofed up the strategy, and that's what kept them from being 1-3 instead, instead of 2-3 in how they finished up behind Max?
No doubt about it. It's very rare slip on their part where they really should have done the other undercut, and they just, for whatever reason, I guess we're going for the overcut. Even that strategy failed because they pitted Norris the same time that they pitted Max. Now, one thing I wanted to bring up is, did you see the pit stop speeds? They were way off for Red Bull.
Yeah, they
They're
were.
like,
They had some very slow stops.
Yeah, it was surprising how bad their stops were because it was that stop that Lando almost passed Max.
Yes.
Almost, like fractions of a second.
Yes.
And Max had him. It was because of their slow stop.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, it was like, Lando almost came out on top of Max.
Yeah.
Coming out of it, and it was only because Max beat him to the timing line was the only reason why Max was in the position that he was in. So
Yep.
yes, they had some very, very slow stops and very uncharacteristic of Red Bull. But I do agree that you're right. They should have split the strategy at the very least. They should have maybe had done something different instead of bringing Oscar in right after Lando and everything.
That was just a bad decision.
Yeah. It really was.
They should have done the overcut with either one of them, and then do the undercut with just like Christian Horner said. He thought at the very beginning of the race, he was like, "Well, they have two drivers, so they can mix and match different strategies. Of course, more than likely they're going to win because you have two different drivers." Well, they didn't take advantage of that, which again is very not typical of them.
Very uncharacteristic.
Yeah.
But yes, very, very surprising.
Yep.
All right, so what's going on at Ferrari? So I've heard a lot of people say, go ahead.
It's Ferrari being Ferrari. I mean, I love you guys, but come on. I mean, the jokes just write themselves.
They do. Now admittedly, like we said, of the top 10, Lewis was the only one to actually make a pass for position and actually finish better than what he qualified. And I think Lewis is really starting to come to grips with the car.
Yeah.
I think that, the fortuitous, sprint win at China aside, but I think that, he's finally, and we said this at the beginning of the season, again, it's one of those things that it's like after being in a Mercedes for so many years and switching to a totally different car, different layouts, different seating positions, everything else, even that, it's like if they, it was like Jacques Villeneuve said over during, I think it was either FP1 or FP2 when he was talking to Crofty, and he told him, when I came from IndyCar and came to Williams, we had all winter to test the car. He said, by the time we got to Australia, I literally had hundreds of hours in the car already before we even got to Australia. Whereas Lewis, he basically had probably maybe what 10, 15 hours total, in
Yeah.
the car, maybe, you know,
Right.
before they got, when you take Bahrain, their private testing at Barcelona, or I'm sorry, not Barcelona, at Catalonia, the couple of runs that he got to do in the previous machinery at Fiorina, he literally had, very little time. If he had had, if they had had the unlimited testing like they did back in the 90s, like what Jacques, and that's what Jacques was saying, is that he was saying if that were the case, then Lewis would have already come into knowing the ins and out of that car, like no, like just in a way that only Lewis could.
Yeah.
And his his um his performance would have been so much higher. That's the reason why Leclerc is still kind of out qualifying him,
Yeah.
and in most of the cases out racing him. It's just simply because he had the last 3 or 4 years
Mhm.
in that Ferrari to learn the nuances of it. And even though it's a new car, it is different from last year's car. There's a lot of the things that still a lot of the knowledge transfers over.
The communication between Lewis and his race engineer just is not there still.
No.
We're 3 races in. I mean, if you want to count the sprint as well, I mean, we're basically 4 in, and Lewis is constantly asking him, "Hey, what's my time? What's the people behind me? What's the people in front of me? Where
Mm-hmm.
am I slowing down?" He's having to ask not being told that. So something's not gelling there. They
Yeah.
need to get a handle on that, because without that information real time, you're as a driver, you're going to make different decisions, because you're basically left on your own devices. So not only
Mm-hmm.
does Lewis have to get the knowledge of how to get the most out of that car, but his strategist and his engineer have to get on the same page. They have to start communicating
Mm-hmm.
proactive, not whenever Lewis says something. What are your thoughts?
No, I totally agree with you that especially like during the race, there was one exchange between them where
Yeah.
Lewis said specifically, okay, where am I losing time? And his engineer came on and said, okay, you're losing time in 8, 9, and I don't
Yeah, yeah.
remember the
What? Yeah,
exact corners, but he told him, but not a lot of information. And Lewis is like literally almost shouting at him over the radio, going,
I know.
I need more information.
Yeah,
How much time am I losing? Who am I
right,
losing it to? Blah, blah, blah.
right.
And it was like you could almost hear the frustration in his
Yeah,
voice and the fact that he wasn't getting the info he needed. So I think you're right that there's still a lot of things a lot of kinks that need to be worked out. Now the thing is though, is that as we talked about before, Freddie Vasseur, helped Lewis to a title in Formula 3 that, I think that, as their working relationship continues to improve, they're going to, it's going to take a little bit of time, but he's going to step in and he's going to make sure that things start to happen to make Lewis more comfortable.
yeah.
I know that Vasseur's leadership will make sure that that happens. So but it's just one of those things that it's going to take time. A lot of, it goes to show just how short memories are in Formula One, that a lot of people don't remember that it took probably half the season for Michael Schumacher when he made his move from Benetton to Ferrari. It took probably close to half a season for him to finally, really start to wrangle all the performance out of that Ferrari that he could, and finally, and work with the team to get the car where he needed it to be, and and the strategy and things like that, and he had the advantage of, unlimited testing
Yeah.
that Lewis doesn't have.
Mhm.
So I think I still think that it's too early
Yeah.
to call it, this to say that Ferrari's, completely blown
Oh,
up for the
certainly
season.
not. No.
Let's have this discussion again at the halfway point.
Yeah.
Let's have this discussion at the summer break.
Yeah.
And I think we're going to be having a much, much different conversation.
Definitely. But there's definitely areas that they need to improve, like now.
Yes. Oh, absolutely. 100%. There's definitely areas that they need to prove that they need to improve now. They need to be, they need to be the things that they work on that are the priority.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so last thing on the list for today is who, after 3 races, who do we think is the top of the midfield? Not just on points, but who do we think that, on performance, who do we think is at the top of the midfield?
Yeah, I know Sainz has been having a little bit of an issue. He's just getting to know the car. Again, 3 races in, 4 if you want to count the sprint. But I'm going to say Williams, man. I think Williams, because looking at Albon and knowing what kind of a driver that Sainz is, I see that team is really going to be the head of the midfield. That's my hope.
Yes. No, I think that Williams is definitely. I think it's actually right now. I think it's for the top of the midfield. I think it's really a 2-horse race between Williams and Haas. Because Haas has looked really good. Bierman has looked, lights out in the fact that he is consistent. He scored points in China. He scored points here. Ocon looked okay. Looked really good in China. He didn't look so good this last weekend at Suzuka, but the Haas looks really, really good. It's unlike a couple of years ago, where it basically it looked really good in qualifying, but then within 3 laps of the race starting, the tires were completely gone, where it just ate through tires and everything. The Haas is much more consistent. It looks much more stable at speed. When you look at it through the corners and everything, it looks way more stable than what it has in the past. So I think right now it's really basically a 2-horse race between Haas and Williams. But
I agree.
I think it's going to be fun to watch that battle as the year goes on. Okay. So that is all the time we have for this trip around Suzuka. Joan Corey and I next week, when we're taking break down all of the action from the Bahrain Grand Prix, we'll have an all-new Stump the Pundit, a brand new history lesson, and lots more. So until then, he's Corey, I'm Scott. We are the pundits of F1 Brake Check. Let's go!
Thank you for listening to F1 Brake Check. If you have enjoyed what you heard, don't miss a single episode by hitting that subscribe button in your favorite podcatcher, or you can watch the video version on YouTube. Help us grow by sharing us with your friends and fellow F1 fans. You can contact us on Facebook, Instagram, Threads, TikTok and X at F1 Brake Check. Our website is f1brakecheck.com, where you will find links to all our content. We value your passion and your feedback, so please take a moment to review our podcast. Your reviews help us grow and improve, and it means the world to us. Share your thoughts, rate us, and let us know how we can make the show experience even better. F1 Brake Check is a production of Brake Check Media. For your hosts Scott Vick and Corey Broom, until next time, keep yourself inside track limits, and try not to pitch it in the kitty litter.